Alice Perkins, who was the chair of the board at UK Post Office Limited at the height of the post office scandal, gave an apology at the public inquiry last week. And that's what I want to look at today. So, the apology of Alice Perkins. A lot of the senior executives at Post Office Limited, POL, have been giving their testimonies at the inquiry, and they've been giving their apologies mostly at the start, and they've been giving apologies that have been mostly poorly received. We aren't seeing the public rushing forward to give them a hug and forgive them. We just see the public getting angrier. The apologies aren't landing very well. I don't think that's because the public are unforgiving. I think it's because the apologies have been unconvincing and ill-judged. So Alice Perkins, she had plenty of time to prepare her apology, and she's seen how the apologies of others have gone down, so she may have taken account of that. Her apology was short, but there's plenty there to unpack. Now, there's every likelihood it was a carefully crafted apology put together under legal advice from her lawyers over many weeks, if not months, even maybe years. It was also in the part of her, or for the most part, it was in her witness testimony, the written witness testimony that she sent to the inquiry beforehand. Now let's start by having a look at the apology that she gave when she appeared before the inquiry, and let's have a look at it in full.
I realise that the words that I'm about to use may not be acceptable to some people, and I understand that, but they are sincerely meant. I want to apologise to all the sub-postmasters and mistresses and their families who have suffered at the hands of the post office. I have some understanding of what people have been through and the different ways in which their lives were wrecked over so very, very many years. I'm more sorry than I can say that despite serious efforts on my part to get to the bottom of what was going on, I did not succeed in doing so during my 4 years at the post office, and therefore the suffering of those affected was prolonged.
There are a few things here. Let's start off with that opening sentence. I realise that the words I'm about to use may not be acceptable to some people, and I understand, but they are sincerely meant. So what's going on here? Well, a couple of things. First thing is, if she realises that her words may not be acceptable to some people, then why use those words? Why not use words that are acceptable? But perhaps what she means by this is that for some people, an apology will never be enough. Now, this is often a reason given for not bothering with an apology or giving a half-hearted apology. But that's a mistake. It's like that thing when someone has bad news to tell you and they preface it with, well, there's never a good time to say this. Well, that might be true, but it doesn't mean that there might not be a worse time, and that maybe you just haven't been bothered to consider if this might be one of those worse times. So in this case, just because her apology is unlikely to be seen as acceptable, it doesn't mean that one way of apologising can't be more acceptable than another. And maybe it was better for her to think that no apology would be acceptable for us, so that it would free her to find an apology that would be acceptable for her. What type of apology might have been best for us? Well, one that came with a genuine acceptance of responsibility. I mean, that would have been a good start. And we'll see later that she didn't really give us that type of an apology. What type of an apology might have been best for her? Well, one that lessened her responsibility. And I think that's the type of apology that we got. Now, before we get there, before I explain why I think we got one of those sorts of apologies, let's have a look at the next sentence.
I want to apologise to all the sub-postmasters and mistresses and their families who have suffered at the hands of the post office.
The sub-postmasters and their families didn't suffer at the hands of the post office, they suffered at the hands of the people working at the post office. Naming the place rather than the person is a tactic. It means you don't have to name the bad actors, and you don't want to name the bad actors if you are also a bad actor who's done some bad things, because if you snitch on them, it increases the likelihood that they'll snitch on you. But there's something more worrying about this sentence. It's containing the harm by not talking about the full scale of the harm. It's not just the sub-postmasters and their families who'd suffered. They took the full force of it, sure, but the suffering has gone way further than that. It's their friends, their neighbours, the staff they employed at the branch. But way beyond that too. Those communities, all those people who saw their sub-postmaster get sacked or jailed. And these people's post office, which they depended on, got closed down. Many of those sub-postmasters were respected and valued members of those communities. And when the sub-postmaster got smashed, it splintered those communities. And everyone who relies on a public service has suffered harm, because money that should have gone to those services will now have to go to pay to repair the carnage that's been left behind. It's been a suffering that scarred the very social fabric of the whole country. It was crass to only refer to sub-postmasters and their families. The pain has been considerable and has ripped far and wide, and that's why the public are so angry. Everyone's feeling it. Is Perkins just ignorant of that? Well, maybe. But maybe it was an echo of what Perkins, Venables, and the rest of them had been doing for years. It was damage limitation, not seeking to limit the social harm, but to limit the damage done to the corporate brand and the professional reputations of those who worked in the post office and who colluded with the executive to allow the scandal to continue for so long, and to limit our view of it by hiding what they'd done and hiding the extent of the harm they had caused. That crass aspect of Perkins' apology got picked up on the second day in the afternoon session, when the key stakeholders got their chance to question Perkins, which Perkins appeared to find a bit tiresome. I'm not sure if it's just me, but it seemed that Perkins' behaviour changed considerably when she was being questioned by those lawyers. The poise she had when talking with the chair, Sir Win Williams, and with the lead counsel, Jason Beer, dropped almost immediately. She became irritable.
I see. Yes.
Sorry, if I'm going too quickly.
You are going extremely quickly, and I've had a very long morning.
I will slow right down.
And no doubt it's safer for her to show her irritation at those lawyers and not at the chair and the lead counsel. But the fact that we could all see it, and she seemed happy to show it, was shocking. When you think that she was appearing at a public inquiry, but not just any public inquiry, one that was looking into the biggest miscarriage of justice in British history, and she appeared to find it tiresome. Anyway, first let's get to hear from Miss Watts. She's a lawyer representing the National Federation for Sub-Postmasters, NFSP. By the way, the NFSP, they kind of turned their back on sub-postmasters at the time of the scandal, really let them down. But let's put that aside for now. So, Miss Watts. She picked up, in her first question, that problem with Perkins' apology as it appeared in her witness statement, the written witness statement that she had sent in. And it's where Perkins referred to sub-postmasters and family, that limitation of Perkins' apology.
You say the failures by the Post Office and the Royal Mail Group prior to the separation of the two companies were considerable and devastating in their impact on the lives of many affected sub-postmasters and their families. I just wanted to start off by asking if you would expand that to acknowledge that the failures also had a devastating impact on postmaster assistants, Crown Office employees and their families, because they were also prosecuted and are also victims.
Yes.
Would you agree that the failures throughout, and that includes the period 2011 to 2015 when you led the board, also had a considerable impact on the communities that the affected post offices and sub-postmasters served?
Yes, they must have done.
I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear.
Oh, sorry, my fault. It's because I was trying to see you
Oh, sorry.
and I moved away from the mic. Sorry.
And would you accept that indeed this is a continuing situation? In other words, it is the case, isn't it, that there is a devastating impact on the post offices and sub-postmasters of today from the damage done to the reputation of the post office and therefore to the value of their investment in their businesses?
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with how the post office is currently faring in that way.
Oh, how could you not answer yes to that third question? She answered, I don't know. I've no knowledge of that. I mean, that could be what we call willful ignorance. Don't look at a thing, because if you do, you'd have to do something about that thing. But in any case, how is it she doesn't understand the damage this has done to how people think about the post office? I mean, it's obviously going to be felt by all those people who still have the misfortune of working there. So how does she not get that? Let's get to the final part of the apology, because it turns pretty terrible.
I have some understanding of what people have been through and the different ways in which their lives were wrecked over so very, very many years. I'm more sorry than I can say that despite serious efforts on my part to get to the bottom of what was going on, I did not succeed in doing so during my 4 years at the post office, and therefore the suffering of those affected was prolonged.
First off, here we see Perkins narrating herself into the story as the hero. I mean, most of us do this. We narrate ourselves as the heroes in our own stories. But it's peculiar to think that Perkins thought that sharing that with us would go down well. Particularly when it was parcelled in what she was presenting as an apology. But as a common form that apologies take in this inquiry, the admission of wrongdoing comes in the form of it not being that they did wrong, but that they didn't do enough right, or that they did everything right, but it was snuffed out by the bad people around them. These are covert denials of wrongdoing that are being dressed up as apologies. Perkins got picked up on this by Mr. Jacobs, who's representing some of the sub-postmasters. And it happened when he ended his turn at questioning Perkins, and he had a question which the sub-postmasters had told him to directly ask of her.
I'm asked to ask you, in relation to your opening statement to the sub-postmasters yesterday, you said, I'm sorry that I cannot say that despite serious efforts on my part to get to the bottom of what was going on, I did not succeed in doing so during my 4 years at the post office, and therefore the suffering of those affected was prolonged. Those sub-postmasters who we represent maintain that your efforts as chair of the board were seriously lacking. Can you respond to that, please?
Now, she did respond, and she engaged in that hero narrative. You know, she said how she pushed for an investigation into the Horizon system. She pushed to extend the scope of that investigation. She said how she had reviewed the post office's policy on prosecutions. So her response to that question carried that familiar line of, I did good things, but there were bad people around me who wouldn't let me do those good things. Now, let's look at the next bit of the apology.
I have some understanding of what people have been through and the different ways in which their lives were wrecked over so very, very many years.
Now, here what's interesting is the doubling up of the word very. She doesn't say that she's very, very sorry, or that the impact was very, very devastating. So why very, very many years? Well, maybe it's because she's setting up for something that comes at the end of her apology. But before we get to that, how about we look at the next sentence, because that contains the only use of the word sorry in her apology. So she's complicated this for us a bit. She hasn't just said, I'm sorry, but she said that she's more sorry than she can say. So why can't she say how sorry she is? Well, maybe that's because it would put her in legal jeopardy. It would contain a statement of guilt. And that's giving her the benefit of the doubt that she knows she's done wrong, but also knows she can't admit it because that would be self-incrimination and should get prosecuted. But here's the kicker. That was not all of that sentence. Here's the full sentence that she spoke.
I'm more sorry than I can say that despite serious efforts on my part to get to the bottom of what was going on, I did not succeed in doing so during my 4 years at the post office, and therefore the suffering of those affected was prolonged.
Now, we might have got distracted by the shock of hearing how Perkins saw herself as the hero rather than the villain of the piece, and we might have missed the 4 years part. That she was there for 4 years. But what I think she was wanting to say is that it was only 4 years, but she couldn't use the word only because we'd get even more mad at her. So she sandwiched it in between the phrase very, very many years that came before the word sorry and the word prolonged, then closes her apology. It gives the impression that these were things that were happening over a very long period of time, and she was sandwiched in the middle for a very short period of time. So how could she be responsible? Certainly she couldn't solely be responsible. This thing was way bigger than her, and so big that she couldn't stop it. It had a momentum, all of its own. That use of wording, I think, is intended to downplay how those 4 years that she was the chair of the board, that she was in a position of authority. She held authority over the board and she gave leadership to the executive. She was in charge. Now, this is a tactic. What's happening here? It's a tactic that's been used all along throughout the scandal. And it started when they first realised there was a problem with Horizon. And the response was, let's just shrink this problem out of existence by denying it's a big problem, denying it's a problem at all, and that way we can keep it out of sight of the public. And here she's just applying that same strategy to herself. And now that it didn't work, the whole thing blew up in her face in relation to the scandal, she, along with the rest of the wrongdoers at the post office, are still playing that tactic. What they're doing is trying to shrink themselves by telling us they weren't involved, they didn't know, they weren't there for very long, and they're hoping that this will work to somehow ensure that they can disappear, maybe disappear down that same sinkhole that they hoped the scandal would have disappeared down, but didn't. Okay, that's enough anger from me. I shouldn't know. Anyway, thanks for watching. Now, if you haven't yet subscribed, could you consider subscribing? It just helps to keep this channel alive and keeps me going. Anyway, thanks for getting to this point. Till next time.